Good evening. It is approximately 7:04 p.m. Item number 1, call the Castle Hills Zoning Commission meeting to order and determine a quorum is present, and welcome new members. Welcome new members. Congratulations to you. I'm not sure if everybody's pushed their button in the center there. If you push your button.
I'm on.
Single. Mr. Todd Herman.
Yes, sir.
New commissioner. Margot Pena.
Correct.
Jana Baker. John Herndon. An additional team member. George, if you'll stand, please.
How you doing?
So, commissioners, and I'm Chairman Joe Rodriguez. We'll go and start this meeting for the Zoning Commission. At this point, approximately 7:05 p.m. in the city of Castle Hills, July 2nd, 2019, in the Castle Hills City Hall, 209 Lemonwood, Castle Hills, Texas, 78213. We do have a quorum present. Did welcome everyone. What I'd like to mention under this is our function as a zoning commission. We make recommendations to the city council. Be making a motion, a second, discussion, and a vote. A sampling of that would be, I move to approve, and so on. I move to not approve. I move to take no action. I move to table to a particular date as an example. Item number 2, administration of oath. Ryan, if I may ask, sir, has everybody been sworn in?
I believe, according to Ms. Gonzalez, everybody has been provided the oath.
Everyone? Okay. Thank you all very much for being diligent and meeting with the city secretary and city manager. Item number 3. It's approximately 7:06. Consider approval of the May 7th, 2019 zoning meeting minutes. Any comments?
Chairman, is your copy of the agenda? We have the April 2nd and May 7th meeting.
Yes. Consider approval of the April 2nd, 2019 and May 7th, 2019 zoning meeting minutes.
I move to accept the meeting minutes of April 2nd, 2019.
Do I have a second?
I'll second that.
All in favor? All right. We need to consider approval of the May 7th, 2019 zoning meeting minutes.
I move to approve the minutes of May 7th, 2019.
I'll second that.
All in favor? Right. Item number 4. Overview and discussion on the process for the development of revising Chapter 50 of the Code of Ordinances and other matters pending the previous zoning commission. Ryan?
Yes, Chairman, I put this on here obviously to discuss what I provided you last week in the email, which is a few documents for your review before this meeting to kind of get you up to speed on what has transpired with not only the zoning review committee, but what the previous zoning commission did in the last 4 or 5, maybe 6 months related to that document. I provided a current codified version, a red line version of what the review committee and the previous commission has done over the last few months. And one of the last things they did in looking at Chapter 5036 parking, accessory building, general lighting, 50-351 minimum off-street parking. Parking has all been captured in this red line version right now, including the updated red lines to the home occupation that Mr. Schnall has prepared that's in the packet as well. The commission took up short-term rentals. Part of that was looking at best practices, what cities are doing. Myself and Mr. Gray, who was on the commission, did a presentation to look at best practices. Again, what cities were doing to try to regulate or impose some type of policy in place in their community to control or regulate short-term rentals. And then also, I provided the local government code 171, which talked about conflicts of interest, and then local government code 211, which talks about state regarding zoning commissions itself. But at the end of the day, the Chapter 50 that has the red line version is everything up to date that the Zoning Review Committee and the previous commission has undertaken to modify or change Chapter 50 currently as of today. Hope that's provides you an overview.
Yes, thank you so much for the documents that you all had provided us. At this point in time, we're able to discuss the overview and some of the detailed items that were presented to us. Does anyone have any comments on what was given to us?
I do have a question. This is for our city attorney, Mr. Schnall. When I was reading through the definitions under local public official in 171.001, it defines who a public official is. And it says that a public official is one who exercises responsibility beyond those being advisory in nature. So my question is because zoning is an advisory commission, does this prohibition or the conflict of interest definitions apply to us? Because we're advisory only and we're not something other than that.
My answer is based upon a conversation I had with the former chair of the Texas Ethics Commission, who spoke at a real estate seminar I attended in Austin maybe 5, 7, 10 years ago. And in his talk, he mentioned the fact that he had just been asked by the member of a city zoning commission about whether she should recuse herself from participation in a zoning case in the subdivision of the city in which she lived. His answer was yes. So I asked him, after his talk during a break, I explained to him that I was the chairman of a local zoning commission and that zoning commission had a matter on its agenda for the next week or so, which involved a piece of property on the street on which I lived that was separated from my house by about 1/4 mile and by a 4-lane state highway, and asked him, should I recuse myself? He immediately said yes. So although the statute does not specifically say as an advisory zoning commissioner, the chairman of the Texas Ethics Commission thought it would apply. Each person needs to make their own individual assessment about the applicability and decide whether they are comfortable going forward, notwithstanding maybe having the kind of relationship to a piece of property that's described in section 171.002, or in a business entity also described in that section, or not. I think it's an individual case-by-case decision. The rule is much clearer, as you suggest, much clearer for a member of the city council than it is for a member of the zoning commission. But I relay my experience and the answer I got from the chairman of the Ethics Commission as something that might be of value to the commission.
Thank you.
Chairman, one other point I'd like to make on the zoning review committee. I believe, and Mr. Schnall can confirm, that probably precedes my time as city manager when it actually started sometime in mid-2017.
Oh, no. I think the first meeting of the zoning review committee, whose recommendations are before you, was in September or October of 2015. The committee presented its final results to the then city manager in May or June of 2016. And little action was taken for a variety of reasons which may or may not be important to worry about until Mr. Rapley became city manager, and then the commission was asked, the former commission was asked front and center to take a look at and consider the recommendations from the zoning review committee. And I will note that you have an opportunity in a later agenda item to go into detail on those kinds of recommendations. This agenda item is limited to overview and discussion of the process. So the process is and was under our ordinance that the city council appoints a zoning review committee every 7 years. That committee is charged with a review of the zoning ordinance and the responsibility to make recommendations to the zoning commission, which then does whatever it needs to do to accept, reject, change, whatever those recommendations, and present a zoning commission recommendation to the city council.
Also, Chairman, I know there was a question in regards to a zoning handbook for y'all as new commissioners. I had not seen a handbook since I'd been in my time, and I reached out to a former employee, Ms. Thielen, who was here for 5 years and doesn't recall one, but Mr. Schnall has a copy from 2012, so we're going to get that updated and sent to y'all. And one of the pages actually outlines when these meetings are scheduled for the rest of the year, which is what I just hand out so you're aware.
Okay. Thank you all very much for what you've put together for this commission. Being new, I think having as many details and documentation that we have for the expectations of this commission, all those documents and details will surely help. So again, thank you. Commission members, is there anything else you may have at this point? Mark, Ryan? No?
Yes, sir.
It is now approximately 7:17 p.m. I would like to go ahead and open up now for the public hearing. Item number 5, public hearing on a proposed amendment to Section 50-1 of the Code of Ordinances to add a definition of impound lot, and on a proposed amendment to Section 50-388 of the Code of Ordinances to prohibit impound lots in the city. Ms. City Secretary, is there happen to be a list, if I could ask, or anyone, if there was anyone that had signed the list for this particular item?
There's just the list of those in attendance, sir.
Oh, that was just in attendance, okay. Would anyone like to speak from the audience, any residents on this particular item? You are welcome to. All right. All
Hi, George Booth, 124 Dogwood. I've spoken several times at the zoning meeting about this. I don't believe that impound lots are very good for Castle Hills. I think it'll diminish our values. I don't really believe the police officers go out to the impound lots to get that much information very often. I've asked Chief Siemens if he had a list of how many times they went out there. He did not, unfortunately, keep track. He said he had a lot of other things to keep track of. Wasn't something he really kept up with. But I've talked with several other police officers that often in San Antonio, and they said they don't really go to the impound lot very often either. They mostly get the information at the scene and write up the report, and that's usually about the end of it. So I don't think we should have it in Castle Hills.
Thank you very much. No one else? It's approximately 7:20 p.m., and we are closing the public hearing on that item number 5. Item number 6, discussion and possible action on a recommendation to the City Council on an amendment to Section 50-1 of the Code of Ordinances to add a definition of impound lot, and on the amendment to Section 50-388 of the Code of Ordinances to prohibit impound lots in the city. If I could mention to the commission, this is your time for open discussion.
And Mr. Rodriguez, I just want to point out, this comes to the commission at the request of Councilman Gregory, and there may be other members of the council who also are concerned about this, but Mr. Gregory specifically asked that this be presented to the Zoning Commission for its consideration. Ms. Baker may be able to help me. I believe it was presented to the former Zoning Commission, and no action was taken on it.
In April.
Ms. Baker, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
And basically, we looked at where impound lots were allowed, and I think they were in G or H. And I have a map that shows there are basically 6 residential properties that would be impacted by an impound lot being placed in the appropriate area. It doesn't mean that if there was ever one, they would have to come and probably get a special use permit or some sort of approval to put it somewhere else. And I believe there was issues with that in the past. Because there are, Antonian is one of the entities, it's not a residence, but it is one of the entities that would be affected if an impound lot was able to go in over there behind the, it's a church and it's the CW lighting and a little strip center behind the railroad tracks. And before they got to the U-Haul storage place, there, it could go there, and then I think there's a couple of other locations. And those do back up to residences, and it mostly backs up to Antonian. So whether or not this commission feels like that would be detrimental to the neighborhood, that's something I think we should discuss. In the past, we didn't feel like it was something we should restrict or deny because we thought the process was already in place to account for it if it ever came up.
Anyone else?
I was going to add to that, I know this issue's been highly politicized almost, an impound lot, nobody wants it. But I think it would be more appropriate if there was an impound lot that, like you said, somebody was trying to actively put one in, or, something to that effect where we could make a decision or a recommendation based on, facts and things like that. But I don't know that I would necessarily make a recommendation at this time for it. I personally am not for them, but I'd have to see more information on the impound lot in question to make a determination on that.
I had a question for the city attorney, John Herndon, 208 Prince. If we ban or do not allow or license impound lots in the city of Castle Hills, are we opening ourselves up to any sort of legal actions for, restriction of property use or eminent domain claims?
It is difficult to see how someone could make a viable claim against the city for restricting just one specific kind of use. Impound lots appear to me to be permitted only in the H district and only with a special use permit. So there was, as I recall, a comment at the prior zoning commission meeting, similar to Mr. Herman's comment, that the commission still could act to deny an impound lot in terms of making its recommendation to the city council based upon the specifics of an active request for someone to put in an impound lot in an area currently zoned H, or to ask that the zoning of a specific piece of property be changed to H to allow the issuance of a special use permit for an impound lot. But I don't feel that denying one kind of use could lead this to an exposure to the city. If the city were to prevent any use of a piece of property or any reasonable use of a piece of property, that would be different.
Any other comments? Anyone? I've got a comment, but I will hold mine here till everyone else is. We have many documents in our possession, and I'm glad for that. And from a standpoint, as I mentioned earlier, this zoning commission makes recommendations to the city council for action. I had the opportunity to review, actually, I think everybody has this, that was in the blue folder this evening, actual 50-388, and vehicle parking and storage. So what the agenda item calls for would be to insert that into that area. The government code compliance with the comprehensive plan, under currentness, zoning regulations must be adopted in accordance with the comprehensive plan and must be designed to, and there's a list of 1 through 7. And 2 of those items happen to be secure safety from fire, panic, and other dangers, promote health and general welfare. And I think, as an example, some of the items Jenna mentioned a couple of minutes ago are of concern. From a standpoint of, do we want to wait or not? But again, just citing some of her comments, and what I was hoping to cite was the specific documentation that we have available to us. Any other comments? This is our time for discussion, Commission.
Please. I'm new here, first day on the job. Is this something that's repeatedly coming up and presented to the commission where we need to make a decision on this? Is council or someone requesting that we make a decision on this regularly, where we just keep kicking
Ours,
down the
as the
road?
zoning commission, is strictly recommendation. It is up to them to finalize, but I will let Mr. Schnall make his comments here.
Well, I think the answer to Mr. Herman's question is that we don't know whether it will be a repeated request. It came from one member of the governing body who was concerned about making sure, as Mr. Booth said, that there not be impound lots in the city limits.
Okay.
Based on that request, the city policy is to forward a request like that that involves a zoning change to the zoning commission for its consideration. There is in your packet a proposed resolution that includes a definition of impound lot and includes the amendment that would be made to, 1, include that definition, and 2, to add to Section 50-388 a subpart C that simply says impound lots are not permitted. So that is in your packet. That would be the action that y'all could take if you were inclined to make a recommendation along those lines to the council. You could make other recommendations if you wanted, but this resolution was done in order to, provide the commission with some guidance if the commission was inclined to go forward and make a recommendation to prohibit impound lots, the proposed resolution would accomplish that, if that were your inclination.
Okay. Any other comments from anyone?
I guess my main concern is, right now, there are currently mechanisms in place in the ordinances that if someone wanted to open an impound lot in the city of Castle Hills, they would still need to come forth in front of and request a special use permit, if I'm not mistaken.
According, and this is, I cannot speak for anybody else, but as I'm interpreting the document, to my knowledge, no, there's not. Because, as an example, 50-388, that is lacking, and that is an agenda item that we have. So as I'm reading it, and as you have a copy of here in the blue folder, that is not in there. All I see is what is in there is currently today is 50-388.
Okay. Well, what I was saying, there was, I believe, 7 properties that were viable candidates for impound lots should it be presented to the city. So would those specific properties, would they be required to request a special use permit and go before council and do that whole thing? I mean, in other words, are there mechanisms already in place that would protect what the citizens would want in that specific?
Right now, as in strictly my interpretation, is that from a zoning perspective, land use, the only thing I see here is 50-388, and there is nothing about impound lots in there.
Well, Mr. Rodriguez, an impound lot is a storage lot. When you strip down the actuality, it's a lot where the police would take a vehicle that was impounded after an arrest or for some other reason where there was cause under the transportation code or the city ordinances for a vehicle to be taken away from its owner. So I think that the word storage lots does permit an impound lot. Mr. Herman's question, if I understand it right, is whether there is other protection against one of these lots, meaning that it would have to come before this commission. And so, because I don't think storage lots are permitted in any district other than the H district, and because to have any use in the H district requires a special use permit, I think the technical answer to Mr. Herman's question is, yes, it would have to come back to this commission. That, however, does not change the fact that we have a member of the governing body who's asked the commission to affirmatively take a stand that the city goes on record in its zoning ordinance to say there will be no impound lots within the city limits. So and I'm afraid it's a little circular, but it does circle back to this commission.
And that, if we took it forward, would give the ability easier for the city to enforce it, as I understand. Okay. All right. If I could ask, we will accept the motion if someone would like to bring one forward. Okay.
And Ms. Pena, if I could ask that you incorporate and adopt the resolution in the packet, which accomplishes that very specifically.
Just
we
to help
could
a bit as a guide, you could read
We could
of
just,
that agenda item, as Mr. Schnall.
we could simply number this as resolution number 1 for tonight's meeting. And Ms. Pena, if you wanted to do this, you could just make a motion to adopt resolution number 1, and the city secretary will make a note of that in her records.
I move to adopt resolution number 1.
And if you'll read the caption, the all caps, 5 lines.
Resolution of the Zoning Commission of the City of Castle Hills, Texas, recommending to the City Council that Section 50-539 of Chapter 50 of the Code of Ordinances be amended to revise the method of nope, that's the, nope, she gave me the.
That's
wrong one.
resolution 2?
Yeah, she gave me that one. Yeah. It's got to be this one. I'm sorry. Resolution of the Zoning Commission of the City of Castle Hills, Texas, recommending to the City Council that Section 50-1 of Chapter 50 of the Code of Ordinances be amended to add a definition of impound lot and that the Section 50-388 of Chapter 50 of the Code of Ordinances be amended to prohibit impound lots.
Mr. Chairman, you have a motion.
All in favor? Aye. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All opposed?
Chairman, just a point that this recommendation will be taken to City Council in August. Again, since you had emailed me on the 24th requesting these items, it was not within the 16 days to publicize a notice in the Express News that we usually do through, which follows state law for notification purposes. So we needed more than 16 days to publish it, so it will be put forward on the August agenda for council's review and recommendation. Your recommendation for approval, so, okay. Just want to clarify that.
Thank you very much. Is there any other timeline on this particular item that you'd like to share with us, or no?
No, just on, obviously this one and the next one, since on the 24th you had requested these to be on here. Again,
Okay.
it's not within the 16 days to get it published for notice per state law.
Okay.
So the other one as well, whatever actions taken or recommendations made on the next item will be on the August agenda as well.
Okay. Thank you very much.
They emailed me the paperwork, but I said, they were like, no, we'll provide you.
It is now approximately 7:35 p.m. I'd like to open the public hearing, item number 7. Public hearing on proposed revisions to Section 50-539 of the zoning ordinance to provide for the city council to appoint members of the Board of Adjustment. Do we have anyone from the audience that would like to speak on this agenda item? Anyone? Anyone?
I'd like to ask a question.
If I could, in just a moment here. Is that permissible now, or the next agenda item, Mr. Schnall?
I think that if you've asked the public twice whether anyone wishes to speak and no one is asked to speak, you would close the public hearing and then move into the next item where the council can discuss and ask questions.
Respectfully, if you'll excuse me 1 second, we'll get right to you. It is approximately 7:37 p.m. We are now closing the public hearing. Item number 8, discussion and possible action on a recommendation to the City Council on revisions to Section 50-539 of the zoning ordinance to provide for the City Council to appoint members of the Board of Adjustment. Commission, this is your time for open discussion. Ms. Pena, I think you had requested.
My question is, in the past, who has appointed the members of the Board of Adjustment?
I really can't speak to that maybe specifically, except to say that all the appointments are actually made by the city council. But the current wording of Section 50-539 says that there is hereby created a Board of Adjustment consisting of 5 members who are citizens of this city and who are not members of the City Council or Zoning Commission. Each member shall be appointed by the mayor and confirmed by the City Council for a term of 2 years beginning on June 1 of each odd-numbered year and ending on May 31 of the succeeding odd-numbered year. So this was a situation where the mayor would essentially name or nominate members of the Board of Adjustment, and then the City Council would be able to confirm them or not confirm them. The change that is requested, again, I believe by a member of the governing body for the zoning commission's consideration, is to change that language that I just read in subpart A and make a few other conforming changes in sections B and C, so that the recommendation, if the commission was inclined to make a recommendation for a change, the recommendation would be to have A read, there is hereby created a Board of Adjustment consisting of 5 members who are citizens of the city and who are not members of the city council or the zoning commission, so no change to that sentence. But then the next sentence would be changed to read, each member shall be appointed by the city council for a term of 2 years, beginning on June 1 of each odd-numbered year and ending on May 31 of the succeeding odd-numbered year. And there's some comparable changes in B and C. I don't have them highlighted or marked.
And for the commission, he was reading off of page 55 in the handout that was given to you. Okay. Any other comments or discussion?
Yes,
Commission
sir.
members?
When we took this up last, a couple months ago, maybe a month ago,
It was in June.
June,
Sorry.
we declined to, I guess, forward it to city council. But since then, I have looked, thank you, Mr. Schnall, for providing us with the local government code. And I went back and expanded my research a little and looked at 211.008. It concerns boards of adjustment. Because I knew what our zoning laws were according to the local government code, but I wasn't sure about board of adjustment. And under 211.008B, it says 5 members of the governing, or you appoint 5 members in the governing body, must provide the procedure for that appointment. And it said that, it says you can have each council member appoint 1 member, and the mayor may appoint 1 member. Or, as we have it here, I guess the governing body decided that the mayor would appoint everybody on the Board of Adjustment. And then I read further under section E of 211.008, and it said the presiding officer of the Board of Adjustment, I'm assuming that's the chairperson, may administer oaths and compel the attendance of witnesses. And based on that, that's a lot of authority that gets appointed to the mayor to create a board. And even though I was opposed to the change last time, based on this research I've just done, I'm inclined to recommend that we grant this change and that we consider the resolution.
Is that a motion, Ms. Baker? I'll accept a motion if someone would like to bring one forward.
I move that we adopt, it would be number 2? Or
Yes, ma'am.
Resolution number 2. Is it appropriate to read off of this?
Again, the caption would be appropriate to read.
A resolution of the Zoning Commission of the City of Castle Hills, Texas, recommending to the City Council that Section 50-539 of Chapter 50 of the Code of Ordinances be amended to revise the method of appointment of members and of alternate members of the Board of Adjustment. And then it continues with whereas. And so my motion is that we allow the Board of Adjustment to be appointed by the council rather than by the mayor, and confirmed by council.
Do I have a second?
I second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Unanimous? Thank you, commission members.
Again, Chairman, that will be on the August council meeting because of the time frame for publication of notice.
Okay. Thank you, everybody, for your cooperation in reading these details, paying attention to the details on those. That was item number 8, and it is approximately 7:44 p.m. I would like to open a public hearing. The public hearing on proposed amendments from the Zoning Review Committee regarding revisions to Chapter 50 of the Code of Ordinances. The discussion will include home occupations and short-term rentals. If I may ask if anyone from the audience, residents, that would like to speak on this item?
Well, I guess you get to see me again. George Booth, 124 Dogwood. I've spoken on this several times about the Airbnb type of rentals. My neighbor has a property that she's renting exterior house behind her main property, and they're not causing any problems. But I think we need to have some rules, and one of the biggest problems that I think Castle Hills is facing right now is the hostels. There's several hostels here in town. They have an enormous, potentially have enormous amount of people, up to 22. I've heard in one property, and I don't think they should be allowed to be in Castle Hills. One of the other problems that I had with this current ordinance is it didn't allow somebody that lives, a homeowner, to actually live in the property and have a rental property as far as, you know, an Airbnb type system that they live there, which I'm strongly against. So if you're going to approve it, you need to allow the owners that live there, they would have more control over the property than an absentee owner. So please consider that, and I'm definitely against the hostels.
Thank you, Mr. Booth. Anyone else from the audience would like to speak? It is approximately 7:46 p.m. We are closing the public hearing. Item number 10, discussion and possible action on a recommendation to the City Council on amendments to Chapter 50 of the Code of Ordinances based on recommendations from the Zoning Review Committee. Again, Commission, this is your time for open discussion.
I had a question for the attorney regarding the existing codes on short-term rentals. And basically, what is our policy now and what was our proposed policy? I saw where Councilwoman McClenn had suggested following a guideline set up by New Braunfels, from what I understood, and they were going to be looked at and discussed further?
Yes, let me give you the kind of the historical background. And although most of you, I think know from my previous comment that I was on the zoning commission, and I was chair of the zoning commission for quite some time. I was on this commission for 25 years and chair for about half of that time. I was also the vice chair and then the chair of the Zoning Review Committee that completed its work in about the year 2008 or 9, and I was the chairman of the Zoning Review Committee that presented the recommendations to the Zoning Commission presented to the city for presentation to the Zoning Commission in May or June of 2016. There is no Castle Hills city ordinance that regulates short-term rentals. Therefore, there are no rules. People can do whatever they want with their property, rent, use, whatever, as long as it complies with the other codes of ordinances, health and safety, whatever, in the city. The recommendation from the 2015-2016 Zoning Review Committee was to prohibit use of a property in the single-family districts, the A district, the AA district, the AAA district, I think the B district as well, the duplex district. That was the recommendation of the Zoning Review Committee. That recommendation was not accepted by the prior zoning commission. And Mr. Gray on the prior zoning commission took the lead in promoting a proposal that would permit short-term rentals with regulation consistent with the regulation in the city of New Braunfels. Ms. McClinn spoke based on her experience, I think, as a lawyer representing homeowners associations, that there was case law that said that a homeowners association could not prevent the use of a residence as a short-term rental. And there's a difference of opinion in the legal community about whether that rule would apply to a city as opposed to a private homeowner association. Be that as it may, the prior zoning commission, I think, voted to ask Mr. Rapley, and with my help if needed, to put together language for a proposed short-term rental ordinance for Castle Hills consistent with the New Braunfels ordinance. So I think that's where things were left. Again, Ms. Baker, as the lone person currently on the commission who was on the prior commission for the last 2 years at least, may be able to shed some additional light on this subject. But as of right now, there is no prohibition against the use of a property as a short-term rental, whether it's through Airbnb or anything else.
Do we have an outline of what the guidelines are and the code is in New Braunfels available to us? Or have you all looked at one as of yet?
I'll ask Mr. Rapley to respond.
One of the things that I provided was a presentation that looked at other cities, obviously best practices. I actually provided this to Todd the other day, was that obviously the previous zoning commission was looking to emulate New Braunfels. They provide a application, permitting and inspections that follows current building codes, international building codes, which includes fire safety. So basically through here, there's an application and a process to apply for a short-term rental in New Braunfels. There's a checklist that the owner would have to go through and provide to the city. There's details regarding utilities and fire inspection and basically requirements. They followed under section 5.17 short-term rental or occupancy in 1 or 2 family dwellings, chapter 144 zoning. And I could get you a copy of all these that kind of outlines their codes as it relates to short-term rental. And the last meeting we had, obviously in June with the previous commission, I drafted an ordinance right now that kind of emulated both New Braunfels, and it was kind of taken from Fredericksburg, which has a similar process and a similar type of community for short-term rentals. And one of the things I'd mention is in my email, and as I discussed with Mr. Schnall, is, you know, for short-term rentals, there's 3 things for this commission to look at, and that's, again, regulating, prohibiting from that standpoint, or regulating in rules by district and doing what other cities do, or not taking any action at all and leave it as it is right now. So,
Thank you.
Anyone else? I had a couple of questions, but anyone else yet?
I got a lot to say, but
Do-
wait till you guys get it out of the way.
Are you sure? Well, go ahead, Tom.
Mostly questions, but no, I did a lot of research about this over the weekend. The concern I have is mostly, people are doing this anyways. I think there's no way that we're gonna stand here and say, oh, well, nobody's short-term renting their house in Castle Hills right now, because I know it's not the case. So how do we best go about that in a way that's both, productive for the homeowners and the surrounding homeowners? And obviously you can generate revenue for the city and bring some facet of control to this thing that's already occurring? Or do we just say, you know what, we're not going to make a decision right now, let's move on? And, you know, the main question I have is, I've got a lot of data that I've kind of put notes together here on this, but, you know, who is going to ultimately draft this, I guess, recommendation to council? Is this going to be something we're going to hash out between us and then make a recommendation to council, or will council do that?
Well, council as in C-O-N-S-I-L, or council as in C-O-U-S-E-L?
Thank you, Mark. That was,
Well, I know, that's a
Okay.
double entendre. Yeah.
Yes, it is. But, I mean, the reality, Mr. Herman, is that if the zoning commission provides guidance to Mr. Rapley and to me, to the city manager and the city attorney, we will put together a proposed ordinance for y'all to consider and debate and tweak or not tweak or accept or reject in y'all's discretion. It would help us to know if this zoning commission as a whole feels sort of the way you described, which is they're essentially what I heard you say is they're going to be here, let's regulate them and let's let people, you know, use their homes in a way that doesn't unduly adversely affect their neighbors.
Correct.
You know, we had a situation on another street in the city not that long ago where the property was being used as a rental, short-term rental, and it was causing a lot of problems in the community. That problem has been alleviated by a combination of the city adopting a more comprehensive nuisance ordinance and by the property owner being informed of the problems the neighborhood was experiencing and essentially firing his management company. So, you know, the concept that I think would help Mr. Rapley and me would be, first, you know, is the commission inclined to permit short-term rentals with regulation, A? If the answer to that is yes, then get an idea of the kinds of regulation that the zoning commission is comfortable imposing. Some examples would be, well, you need a permit. You need a permit to have a short-term rental. You have to have maybe it's also that the property has to be inspected. Maybe it's also that any sleeping room in a short-term rental has to have a smoke alarm. Maybe it's every sleeping room has to have a carbon monoxide monitor. Maybe it's that the property needs to have a fire extinguisher or a first aid kit or a notice posted on the wall with emergency numbers. You know, if these are people, when you stay in a hotel, on the back of the hotel door, there's a map of the floor you're on that shows you the fire exits. I'm not sure we need that in a single-family residence, but maybe we do need something on the wall that tells people if you want to call the police or the fire department, dial 911. If you have a non-emergency call for the police department, call 342-2341. I mean, things like that. Also, maybe want to post information about who they can call in the case of a non-public safety emergency, like I can't get the water off and I don't want to flood the place. And a number like that, which might be to a real estate management company, it might be to the owner, you know, something like that. Those kinds of requirements seem to be reasonable. The ordinance could, for example, restrict the amount of outdoor activity or noise-generating activity. It could regulate parking such that there has to be some on-site parking, whether it's in a garage or a carport or just in a driveway, as opposed to, you know, have, you know, 6 people renting this short-term rental for the weekend and each one driving a big SUV.
Yeah.
Things like that.
Okay.
I would try and stay away with requirements that go much beyond public health and safety. I don't think that it makes sense to regulate other kinds of things. I sort of think of it in the concept, in the context of, well, what does the city require for a new business? A new business coming into the city, in the G General Business District would probably need a certificate of occupancy. And that process may involve the building inspector making sure that there is a variety of different things that are called for in our codes that would affect public safety. I would stay away from things that we don't generally enforce in the business district, except, as I mentioned earlier, the smoke detectors and the carbon monoxide detectors in sleeping rooms, because we're all supposed to have smoke detectors in our single-family residences outside each sleeping room. And it's wise to have a couple of carbon monoxide monitors in today's world. So, if you could give the staff some guidance along those lines, I think we could come back with a proposed ordinance that might track New Braunfels, it might track Fredericksburg. It probably won't track San Antonio's. San Antonio's ordinance, if I remember right, is 19 or 21 pages, and it has a limit on how many short-term rentals can be in the same block, and probably a little bit more than Castle Hills needs. We can also look at reasonable limits on the total number of occupants.
Yeah.
But I want to stay away from those limits being very low, because there are U.S. Supreme Court cases which prohibit extraordinarily low occupancy counts in a residence, especially of unrelated people. So we want to be careful not to go too far that we end up having our ordinance being attacked on constitutional grounds.
Well, I mean, you guys have.
No,
Okay.
go ahead.
I spent some time speaking with Luis, the code enforcement officer, and, he said this is a current problem, and there's no real mechanism that they have other than what's currently on the ordinances, where they can go after noise issues, they can go after parking issues, trash, things like that. I point blank asked him, I said, is this really a problem that you feel that zoning needs to address? And he says, absolutely, because it will give me the tools I need to enforce these types of problems for the residents. So I think that's very important, and I think in drafting this type of ordinance, if we make the recommendation to the city manager, I would restrict things like type 2 STRs, which are, non-owner occupied rental properties. So somebody buys a house and they turn it into an Airbnb. I don't think that's a very good fit for our city, kind of similar to Austin's practices. And Austin was pretty restrictive, I thought, in some of their STR guidelines. But I think the certificate of occupancy should cover the maximum amount of occupants, including the owners of the home, right? Mark?
If the commission determines that the only Airbnbs have to be owner occupied, and Mr. Booth made a point to comment about that during the public hearing. I don't know what percentage of Airbnbs are owner occupied. I think, some people would consider that to be a greater restriction than might be comfortable or appropriate. I don't know. We have a community of beautiful homes, and I think we all want to, maintain that community. But, the question is, how far do you go? Whatever is done, folks who can show an pre-existing use are likely to be grandfathered until that use is abandoned. But as I say, whatever you all want us to draft, we will put together.
Well,
And if we run into a situation where you want us to put something down that we feel is unlikely to pass some kind of legal challenge, we'll tell you. And you can still decide to tell us to do it. You can still decide to recommend it to the council. I just want you to make an informed decision.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what I'm mostly getting at is, I'd emailed you over the weekend about some legal questions. And, I think, whatever it is we do, we need to try to keep the residents in mind, first and foremost, and then safety, like you had mentioned earlier. I don't see anything, that I would make a decision on right now, but I would love to see some more information on this and really dig into this, because I think, again, at the end of the day, this is already happening and it's affecting people, and we need to I think, make some kind of a intelligent decision based on what you guys recommend we do.
And I can send, I can send everyone, like I mentioned earlier, a copy of the Braunfels application that outlines those measures that are in place from a regulatory standpoint, but it has standards where it goes through occupancy, short-term rental, having an actual decal to display that you are a short-term rental in the community, parking and addresses, life safety, conduct on premises, talking about noise, trash, those kind of things. And then you have to provide a site plan or layout to your short-term rental of your property in the community, which obviously there's a checklist here that the inspector would go out and make sure it all complies within building and/or international building codes regulations.
One of the things I think that's really critical about having some sort of ordinance that regulates short-term rentals is without it, we're not able to effectively shut them down. So one of the considerations the city manager provided was like 3 strikes you're out. If you get violations and the police have to come and you have been cited 3 times within a time frame, they will restrict your ability to operate, and then you can't advertise on all the websites that people find you on. And I think that's something that we need to do. I'm not as inclined to restrict the non-owner occupied. We had a number of people that came in, and there were 4 or 5 at least houses that were not owner occupied, but no complaints except for the one house, and that was on Winston, have ever, to my knowledge, been an issue. The other thing we do have to consider, though, are hostels. And Mr. Schnall, have you seen any regulations on hostels at all? Because I haven't, but I haven't looked either.
I've seen them, but I can't tell you they're in Castle Hills. I mean, my day-to-day working knowledge of the zoning ordinance, is something that's in the past. There may be something in our zoning ordinance or in other codes that does limit the number of unrelated people who can be living in a residence. That's kind of the way that's talked about in the legal industry is no frat houses, for example. I'm not sure. There may be something like that in our city ordinances. That's the closest thing I can think of to hostels. I've certainly seen those in some cities because I've looked at a number of city zoning ordinances over my career. I do think that a reasonable limit on the number of occupants of a single-family residence is appropriate, but we have all different size single-family residences in our city. And so is it fair to say no more than 5 unrelated people if you've got a 7-bedroom house? I'm not sure it is. But I think New Braunfels or Fredericksburg or one of those cities does have a limit on the number of people over the age of 17. And that's another way to look at this, to try and consider that and to try and deal with a potential problem with hostels. Again, if it's already being done and it's in compliance with our code today, passing some ordinance doesn't make it illegal. It becomes grandfathered and continue until it's abandoned, again, consistent with our ordinance for the requisite amount of time. But doing something, which I think is what Ms. Baker and Mr. Herman are suggesting, doing something begins to set a process and begins to get this moving in a direction that if the commission is inclined to move, we can assist in doing that.
Go ahead. Anything else? Yeah. Commissioner Herman and Baker, excellent points, and thank you for doing some of that research. I hope everyone has had a chance to peek at a lot of the slides that were in the PDF, and they had some good information. And there were multiple cities, I think, on the chart as an example, from a standpoint of allow or not allow, as far as short-term rentals. I also saw a point in there in regards to the legislature. Is there anything outstanding or anything at all right now from a legislative perspective that is pending?
There is not. I mean, legislature is finished for this year. It is unlikely the governor will call a special session unless he's forced to deal with regulation of plumbers, which for some reason didn't pass. I'm looking in my file. I think I have 4 bills that were filed in the legislative session that ended toward the end of May. I think it ended on Memorial Day this year, that would regulate on a statewide basis for statewide consistency short-term rentals. None of them passed. None of them got through both houses of the state legislature. Mr. Herman mentioned the Austin ordinance, which I do think is a very restrictive ordinance. One of the ordinances that was, one of the resolution bills that was introduced in the state legislature was patterned on the San Antonio short-term rental ordinance, which may be a great ordinance for a large city, probably not a great ordinance for Castle Hills, which is why I think that, Mr. Gray and Mr. Rapley gravitated toward short-term rental ordinances from smaller cities, neither New Braunfels nor Fredericksburg necessarily being as small as Castle Hills, but a lot closer than San Antonio or Austin or Dallas. So there's nothing on the state horizon. However, those of us who have followed the legislature know that it often takes 3 or 4 sessions of the legislature to get a bill through on a subject like this. So there were bills introduced in the legislative session in 2017 that did not pass. There were 4 bills at least in the 2019 legislature that didn't pass. That doesn't mean that there won't be more in the 2021 legislature, and those bills will preempt, override a local ordinance. But we won't have any of those, most likely, if at all, until 2 or so years from now. So if you all want to begin a process of dealing with this issue in Castle Hills, it is in the discretion of the Zoning Commission to make a recommendation to the City Council along these lines.
Okay. Also, Mr. Rapley, I noticed in the slides there was an item that mentioned, I guess, the schematics of the home briefly. I'm not sure if those would need to be certified by someone or they'd be drawn on a napkin. I mean, just from a standpoint of a form of a checklist, it would be nice that our city requirements, strictly a comment here, our requirements would almost be in the form of a checklist and say your schematic of your home cannot be on a napkin. It would have to be by a certified individual, or, there's a list of these particular companies that provide these services for X dollar amount, whichever. If they're seriously considering being an entity as a short-term rental within the city of Castle Hills, we might get that sort of detail. Also, from a standpoint of, of other areas, I think a checklist would help from a standpoint of compliance. And Commissioner Herman mentioned he had spoken to our compliance person, Luis, I think you said, and the ability to afford that person to actually enforce in a variety of instances. Any other comments that anybody would have as to steps forward for this commission to protect our residents and protect the city and try to make some strides forward? Because I think what has been presented is very good, and in addition, you did a lot of research this weekend. And Commissioner Baker, such. Anybody else?
I have
Anything?
a question. Do the Homeowners that own the Airbnb or the proposed Airbnb, do they have to ask permission from their neighbors that are next to them or behind that property if they're okay with that?
That's a good checklist item.
All right?
Let's,
I don't know, I would default to Mr. Schnall's expertise on that one.
I don't know of any ordinance that requires that.
I would think that'd be.
The closest thing that I can think of is the San Antonio ordinance, which limits one short-term rental property for every 8 houses, so that they're not clustered together. But I don't know of any city ordinance that says that to get an Airbnb, you need to go to your neighbors and say, "Mother, may I?"
yeah, and you're bringing up some points. As an example, the yellow signs that go up, and then the residents get mailed some form of documentation or a letter within, I think it's what, 500 feet of, as an example, but that is
200
something else that,
And Mr. I can't remember Luis's last name I keep wanting to call him Cuellar, but it's not Luis Cuellar. He was a wealth of knowledge, and I would love for him to be, used in. A code officer is a super smart guy. I mean, he had but what he said was it doesn't really, if somebody does an Airbnb at their house and for any reason the neighbor doesn't like it or the surrounding houses don't like it, if they are inclined enough to make a complaint a certain amount of times, they're going to fall under the current ordinance, which is going to require them to come before a judge, and they're going to try to find out why. And I believe he said they even have to place a $7,000 bond if they breach that or something. So it was pretty.
see, there's another checklist item in some of the slides that we also saw. Mr. Schnall, sorry.
Well, to just clarify what Mr. Herman said, that is sort of what's in the new nuisance ordinance. That there's a citation before the municipal judge. If there are 3 violations, then the person does have to post a bond. I don't think it's $7,000. I thought it was $2,000, but it doesn't really matter what the amount is. It's an ordinance with real teeth in it.
Yeah.
That would really, was written and designed to address the kind of problem that the community was having on South Winston, that problem that went away. So there is a nuisance ordinance that will address these concerns. What there isn't is any kind of ordinance that says that the city is going to be policing, if you will, the health and safety aspects of a piece of property that's being basically rented for commercial purposes, even if it's a residential property.
I guess what I would like to encourage this commission to do is to recommend to city manager that we create, not we, you create proposed ordinances and guidelines falling within health and safety regulations that would give us a template to look at, because so far we've just been fractionalized with all kinds of ideas and recommendations for different cities. I think if we had something formalized, your recommendation for what this city needs, then I think we would be better able to come to a resolution.
Could I also make a comment there? In the public hearing right before this, item number 9, anyway, the discussion of possible action, there was the occupations and short-term rentals, which under 10 here, please correct me if I'm wrong, what zoning review committee, it was the home occupations and short-term rentals. Am I correct?
Not exactly. The zoning review committee, there's a specific division in the zoning ordinance, I believe it begins with 50-427, about home occupations. And the zoning review committee spent a lot of time discussing a recommendation to modify the current ordinance. The zoning commission precedent to you spent a lot of time talking about those rules and asking that the city manager and the city attorney provide a model of what the commission might consider to differently and perhaps a little bit more intensely regulate home occupations. And when Mr. Rapley and I did a division of labor on these items in April or May, he drew the short-term rental straw, thinking that, that would be something he would be in a good position to do. And I drew the home occupation straw. And so what I did, and what's in I think the last 3 pages of the packet that was sent out, is the proposed new language for home occupations that is a result of the prior zoning commission's comments and concerns about what the zoning review committee had presented. And the intention was to follow the guidelines that prior zoning commission had. But that prior zoning commission does not exist anymore. And it's now this zoning commission. So this language is here. It's not like the short-term rental language, which is yet to be fully fleshed out, because I think Mr. Rapley wanted to get more guidance on what direction and to what extent the current commission wanted to deal with that. This home occupations language is designed to regulate but permit a reasonable home occupation that does not interfere with the folks who own properties nearby. Home occupation rules are more and more common now. The work from home, telecommuting economy has really taken hold. We should keep up with that as best we can. Whether these 2.5 pages meet y'all's desires and conditions, I leave to you.
The reasoning for my question there is that I think that 2 different motions or recommendations could be made. We could split that up in regards to home occupations and the other for short-term rentals. And Commissioner Baker just made some comments on the short-term rentals as to possible movements forward, but I just wanted to bring that to everyone's attention, that the item before this did mention those 2 items, and then our counsel, Mr. Schnall, did make some comments in regards to both of those items. So I just wanted to bring that to everyone's attention. It's up to this commission if you would like to take some form of action. As an example, Commissioner Baker's is the first item, and then possibly the second one, but I will leave that to this commission. What I will do is accept a motion if someone would like to bring one forward.
I move that we instruct the city manager to create a short-term rental ordinance for our consideration and review. And I believe I would like for it to include both owner-occupied and non-owner-occupied. And I agree with Mr. Schnall about including the health and safety aspect of smoke alarms, site plans, pretty much everything that New Braunfels had in it.
Do I have
I'd like to second the motion, yeah.
second?
And on that point, Ms. Baker, as the chairman asked earlier, the site plan example that's given like in New Braunfels, you have to actually provide a pretty detailed plan that shows portions of your deed that outlines basically your property line, street name. All those kind of factors have to be in this site plan to be included for review and approval once you try to apply for a short-term rental in this community. So it's pretty detailed on what they do. So if anything, we could probably emulate at that point.
Can we do any type of projections in this report for what the city would possibly be making off of the annual, just for grins? Or is that too much?
It might be something where we can kind of do some type of, provide some kind of future numbers on it.
Guesstimate?
Again, as I provided the presentation to y'all in the packet that I did, it talked about some of the positives, which is, obviously a potential tax for this application, inspection fee revenue. So we can look at that. It's obviously depending upon the number of short-term rentals that we actually have in the community. And it may be something we can't project the revenues until we see after 1 year the growth based on the regulation of Castle Hills enacting some type of process to regulate them. Again, we don't have a hotel occupancy tax either, so it would have to be created as well to be able to collect.
And I was going to simply make that second point that Mr. Rapley made. Before I do that, we can look and see what the city of Castle Hills charges as its standard fee for a certificate of occupancy in the G General Business District, on the theory that this is a business use of a residential property, and it involves the inspection and the checking out the health and safety. We don't want the city to lose money by permitting these. It doesn't have to be a profit center either. So that's kind of like the initial permit fee. And then second, as Mr. Rapley just said, it's outside the purview of the zoning commission. But it is important that if the zoning commission makes a recommendation to allow short-term rentals, it is important that the city council take action to adopt a hotel motel tax, that the city could receive a tax income from each rental. That is another secondary source of revenue that's really recurrent, as opposed to a one-time certificate of occupancy fee. But I definitely agree with Mr. Rapley that until we know how many we've got and how many people apply, we don't know. One thing that many cities do is if you start doing something that needs a permit, and the permit fee is $100, but you start and don't have a permit, when they catch you and they tell you to get a permit, your permit fee is double. And I would certainly want to incorporate something like that to make sure that people get the point. I don't want to penalize people unnecessarily. We could publicize it, we could give a grace period, but we don't want to be taken advantage of.
I think we can come with a base based on, like Mark said, our permitting process now. For instance, again, referencing New Braunfels here, there is an initial application fee and an initial annual fire inspection fee that has to be renewed every year. And if you fail to, then you won't, it'll jeopardize you getting your renewal. So, but again, based on our fee schedule, we can look to see how we incorporate that and what might be the right fee to actually charge here in Castle Hills.
Commissioner Hernan?
I know we can't force somebody for licensure that's already got an ongoing bed and breakfast, short-term rental, but can we require them to at least file for licensure rather than having to comply with all the new guidelines?
My view would be that once we pass the ordinance, they would need to get into some sort of compliance. The concept of if the commission were inclined to instead say they're prohibited, we couldn't stop an existing use. But as far as continuing existing use, under the new regulations, we might allow a grace period, but we should encourage all folks who are, maintaining a short-term rental to meet these basic, licensure, permit, health and safety regulations, because it's a matter of public safety. We don't want someone, renting a house that's a fire trap, because that doesn't just affect that house, it affects all the neighbors. So we do want to do as best we can to protect the community that way.
And that's, if I can make just one quick, go ahead.
I have a question. Who would do the inspections? Would it be our code compliance officer, or would we have to have a subcontractor do the inspections like we have for the building?
Right now, we contract out for plan review and inspections right now for all of our permitting process. So it would be the same building inspector. As far as fire, we have someone deemed as a fire marshal in our fire department that would also do, he also does plan review and inspections of those properties in our community, both residential and commercial. So it'd be the same two gentlemen doing each inspection, both fire and compliance of the building itself.
So the permit fee would need to be sure, we need to be sure that this permit fee is adequate to cover our out-of-pocket cost for that outside service.
I am aware that we've got a first and a second, but we still have some discussion here.
Yep.
Any other commissioner?
I was just going to articulate a point that my concern with the type 2 STRs is that, if there is an issue, it's hard to reach the owner sometimes because the guy's not there. And so you got to track the owner down and then, hey, there was this problem at your facility or your house and, I wasn't aware. I mean, it just seems kind of like you're more, almost like asking for more issues than if.
Well, again, having a permitting process helps that because you'll be able to contact. And going back to your reference earlier about what Mr. Zamarone spoke about, the Airbnb, and when there was violations or potential violations, the management company wasn't cited, it was the owner. And so that helped, not only from the nuisance standpoint, but it was a direct contact to the owner to make him aware that these violations are on him versus the management company that's
yeah.
conducting these Airbnbs.
Okay. Well, as long as there's verbiage in there that covers that kind of thing, that's just a concern I have is, my dealings with vacation rentals and things like that is, you don't want to have difficulty getting a hold of the actual property owner if there is a problem or if you need to get in for an inspection and he's out of town or something, I think that's a concern.
Okay, anyone else? We have a motion, it was seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
Unanimous? Under this Section 10, I also mentioned that prior to that, there was,
Chairman, real quick, sorry.
yes, no,
So in coming back from a standpoint, we will put something together for what would be the August meeting. And if you all approve something, then, and/or recommended something, that would probably be the September City Council meeting. Just trying to give you a timeline.
thank you.
Okay?
Okay. Home occupations, I mentioned just another item to consider. I think that we were provided with, as an example, a red line in regards to that. I'm not sure who all has had a chance to look at some of those items. I don't think it was great in length, like 6 pages. It was short. But anybody have any discussion on that while we're still on this agenda item, or any questions that they would like to ask in regards to the home occupations? So I think we have that leeway at this point, or maybe to reference a page number if anybody had a question of anybody in regards to that. I'm not sure, is anybody on that page right now or not? Or question to Mr. Small, as he had mentioned, they drew straws.
One of the issues that came up is the aspect that there was a construction business being operated in a residential neighborhood at a home. And it took a very long time to bring those people to court to address the noise, the pollution, the constant and out of normal business operations. They would show up 4 or 5:30 in the morning, and they're big equipment, so they have their beepers when they back up. There's lights, there's people picking up equipment. And in reviewing our home occupancy, I noticed that we did not have any restriction on a construction company being operated in a residential area. it came up to zoning last time, I think our very last session. And so it's important for citizens to let us know when there's issues, and they can communicate with the city manager. They can contact any one of us, and we could raise those issues or at least discuss them. So my position is I would like to see under one of the items, 11, 12, 13, we add in no construction businesses, especially
If I may, Commissioner Baker, you're on, out of the
Sorry.
Chapter 50 zoning, you're on page 43 from what was
Yes.
given to us this evening in the blue folder.
Section 50-427, and there's 1 through 13 items that it discusses. And when it starts discussing, it involves commercial, one of them under 6 involves commercial vehicles. And this occupation certainly involved commercial vehicles, but further down, we talk about restricting funeral taxidermy, which I think are all things we should, tattoo parlors, furniture stores, restaurants, clubs, under 11, boat sales, repair, painting, heating, plumbing, or air conditioning services. I think it would be appropriate after air conditioning services to also add in construction sites or construction companies. But I want y'all to consider that. I've been here longer and I know some of the other issues. And the only other one that gives me concern is that there was a lady who is a medical doctor, wants to do consults out of her home, but we have a provision in this current draft that restricts medical. And I'm trying to remember, other than having hazardous waste, that was our main issue on not allowing medical, and then also that people would be showing up every 15 minutes, and that was not her scenario. So I just want this commission to think about those things as we discuss this. Mr. Schnall?
It would seem strange to me to go to a physician who's practicing out of her or his residence. That just seems strange to me. There could be hazardous waste issues, as you suggest. You know, I have a friend who's a radiologist, and he reads x-rays on his very large, very expensive computer, and he writes reports. That, to me, is fine as a home occupation. I don't consider that to be medical care. It may be medical services indirectly, but it has no impact on anyone else except the people who live with him. It's whatever the commission wants. You know, I view this not as the last draft. I view that this is the current draft. You know, your suggestion to add construction services at number 11 makes perfect sense to me. If you want to further qualify or further define the medical side, that's fine too. But, you know, of all the doctors I've ever gone to, they've always been in medical office buildings for some reason.
I mean, I don't really have a say with what someone does inside of their house. I don't think we should really be getting a whole lot involved in that. Otherwise, you know, it's a slippery slope. But, you know, I think if someone is running a construction company or they're running a drum cymbal test business out of their at some point the neighbors are going to complain, and then it's going to fall under the nuisance laws that we have, and it's going to self-regulate. You know what I mean? So I don't know that, because construction is like a super broad term too, and I think that, you know, are they actually constructing something? Are they just operating the heavy equipment? Is it, you know, like, I think we would need to be pretty specific on that, because I think construction is pretty broad, you know, we'd want to fine tune it a little bit more, but I just, a physician that wanted to operate out of their house, if there's traffic going nonstop, then I would be concerned about it. you know.
Commissioner Baker, Commissioner Herman, I think you bring some good points up. But as we've seen two instances earlier, I won't go into them, that if they have the ordinance or the tools to work with and permit, as Mr. Rappelai had mentioned earlier too, the different pieces, we allow the city something to work with. So you bring up some fine points. Is there anything else that anybody would like to add or question of Mr. Schnall that could aid us while he's here? Anyone? The commission? Some very good input, by the way. Specifically in regards to the home occupations, I mean, if, we'll accept the motion if someone would like to bring one forward, if you think it's appropriate in regards to this.
I guess I'd like to know whether or not the other commissioners feel comfortable making a final decision this time. Would you like more time to review?
I would definitely think a little more research would be needed for me to make a good decision on something like that.
Okay, I'll entertain a motion if someone in regards to that, if you could term that at all so that we could act upon it at a later date. Is there anything?
I don't know how to do that.
Or?
If the commission isn't ready to, get into the weeds on the home occupation proposal, then you don't have to take any action. It will just automatically come back as part of your next meeting. There'll be an agenda item on, continued review of the recommendations from the Zoning Review Committee. And that's fine. I mean, these last two issues, the ones that were specifically mentioned, short-term rentals and home occupations, were also items that the predecessor zoning commission and frankly, especially the home occupations, the Zoning Review Committee, did spend a fair amount of time on. So I, certainly appreciate y'all's interest in doing the same and, making sure you're making the right recommendation.
Chairman, I would suggest, though, as we looked at short-term rentals as best practices, we could maybe look at some other cities who deal with the same type of home business with construction to see what we could incorporate, what other cities are doing to address. So maybe we can bring that back to the next meeting so y'all could see as well.
Okay, some good comments.
I'd like to see something on maybe the parking, stopping, standing of construction equipment, even temporary parking of construction equipment in a residential neighborhood. Something on those lines, rather than just eliminating construction services. Maybe it's the equipment and the parking that seems to disturb most people, and probably the easiest to enforce.
As an example, as Mr. Stahl mentioned, we could do nothing or a motion to take no action or table it or.
I move that we pass this item until our next scheduled meeting for further review and discussion.
Second that.
Second. All in favor? Unanimous.
Again, Chairman, this would follow the same time frame to bring back to the August meeting and then provide a recommendation for possibly City Council's approval in September.
Okay. All right. Item number 11, discussion and possible action on additional recommended changes to Chapter 50 of the Code of Ordinances.
Mr. Chairman, I believe we have a citizen who wishes to address the commission. He made a brief presentation at the May Zoning Commission meeting, but I think he wants to be heard this evening.
If I just could ask, Commission, would take a vote? That's fine with everybody?
I'm fine.
Thank you, Mr. Schnall.
Welcome, new committee members. My name is Andy Ronan. I live at 102 North Manton. I would like to see if we can look at possibility of changing some ordinances with commercial properties that are within 200 feet of residents, with maybe possibly putting up walls or barriers to block lights from cars. I'll use an example, Sushi Hana. They have a lot of cars coming and going. After it gets dark, there's headlights going into residents' homes. And there was a possibility of that happening across the street from my house as well. So I would like to try to nip this before something moves in and I have to deal with this on my street. And second, I would like to also try to see if we can change some zoning rules on fast food delivery windows and things of that nature, apps where you order and you're waiting in your car for food to come out. On Northwest Military, I think there's enough traffic, and there's too many residential streets dumping on Northwest Military, I think, to allow an establishment like McDonald's or Starbucks to move in and have that much additional traffic in the area. So I think if we can pass some rules to where we don't allow fast food windows, I think that would be good for the neighborhood. Sit-down restaurants are fine with me. I don't think that's a problem, but I think the fast food joints is going to end up turning Northwest Military into a San Pedro type thoroughfare. And I don't think that's going to be a good look for our city. So maybe if we can get some things changed so we don't have to deal with this later on after this area grows into a San Pedro type area, which it's going to do in the next 10 years, I think. So,
Sir, may I ask your first and last name again?
Andy Ronan,
Andy Roman?
R-O-N-A-N.
R-O-M-E-N.
R-O-N-A-N.
R-O-M-A-N.
Yep.
Apologize, sir.
Yep. So,
If I could ask just two questions from the standpoint of, have you put together anything from a standpoint of a list or anything in writing? I guess, have you had concerns, or has there been any formal complaint that you've had to provide to the city on any of the items that you mentioned?
no. I mean, we just had the Snack Bites that was going to move in across the street from my house. That was really what started this, and me thinking about the future of my house and my neighbors and what we would be dealing with if something like that happened. So I'm trying to think ahead and get things done. So we're not dealing with what we're dealing with the rental houses and all that right now. It seems like if we had something in place beforehand, that would have been easier to handle now. So.
I think what you're mentioning is actually a couple of items. I think the commission, I'd like to ask if you'd agree if Mr. Roman, I guess for some of his mentions this evening, to provide some sort of list to our city offices with the city manager and the city secretary, just so that we have that on file, as speaking here at a public forum, that we at least would get a chance to review, Mr. Roman.
Yeah, and if there's any questions that anybody has about what I'm bringing forth.
Commissioners, any?
I have a question for the city attorney. Do we have the ability legally to restrict these types of activities?
I think that the commission and the city can impose a reasonable screening requirement. There already is a screening requirement where a commercial use adjoins a single-family A residentially used property. So perhaps expanding that a little bit to meet Mr. Ronan's suggestion about walls and lighting, is likely to be feasible and practical. The limitation on fast food delivery windows and things of that nature on Northwest Military have somewhat different challenges to them, and we just have to make sure that it was drafted in a narrow and concise fashion, not mentioning any brand names, for example, and just addressing the concern that Mr. Ronan has raised about the impact on narrow side streets, residential side streets off of Northwest Military, if they are unduly impacted by increased traffic in the community. I mean, most of those streets along there are just barely 2 lanes wide. There are a few curbs, and I don't know if there are any sidewalks on most of those streets. So I think couching it and looking at it from a traffic safety standpoint, is another way to address the concern that he raises. And for full disclosure, I live on one of those streets.
Commissioner
I actually
Herndon?
had a question for the city attorney. If we were interested in furthering this, what would be the process? Would we ask that the city manager draft a first draft resolution, and then we look at it further, or what would be the process? Or would we go to the city council and ask that they request this?
I think you have a request from a citizen, so that would give you the leeway as a commission to ask staff to look into this and prepare a proposed recommendation, a proposed resolution of a recommendation to city council along these lines. There's no reason why you couldn't ask city council if they want you to do it, but you have a request from a citizen that's a pretty clear request, and it seems to me that you could go ahead and request city staff to put something together for future consideration by this commission.
I will request that.
Mr. Herman?
I will definitely request that. There's nothing on the agenda to reference in order to do that
Okay.
specifically, but yeah, I would like to request that city staff investigate the mechanisms and the methods to how to do that properly.
Okay. If you'll hold that thought, well, I'll be asking to entertain a motion here in a minute.
Okay?
Sir, Mr. Roman?
Any other questions? That's good.
No. So we're discussing here. Mr. Small, Ryan, anyone?
Oh, no, nothing.
So again, agenda item 11, as I read earlier, discussion and possible action on additional recommended changes to Chapter 50 of the Code of Ordinances. In regards to this, I'll accept a motion here, and I think as the sample I made at the very beginning of this meeting, the samples of motions that we could make. So I will ask, I'll accept a motion now if someone would like to bring one forward for agenda item 11, if they so choose.
I have a question. Are those other items, one of them being solar energy systems, and I think that one and the wind energy were two that we were going to consider, is that correct?
No, ma'am.
Oh,
I believe the prior zoning commission had pretty much accepted the recommendation from the zoning review committee about solar, and accepted the recommendation made during a prior meeting that we don't need any wind energy matters. We're also not on that agenda item anymore. So we're on something other than the zoning review commission recommendations. We're on additional recommendations, but I did want to give you a factual answer to your question.
Okay. Specifically, in regards to agenda item 11, if I may ask again, I would accept a motion if someone would like to bring one forward.
I would like to bring one forward. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
I don't have the format here. Go right ahead.
I don't either. No, there isn't one specifically listed, so we would be kind of adopting one.
Okay? Let's go. Oh, wait, that's what he was looking for. Okay. Yeah, the agenda. That's the agenda, number 11 is, yeah, it was here.
I'd like to make a motion for possible city manager action on looking at a limiting of drive-through along Northwest Military and possible other streets that might fit similar criteria, and that it be brought back to the zoning commission.
Okay, we have a motion, do we have a second?
I have a second.
All in favor? Oh, none? Unanimous? Nope. Let me go back. Ms. Peña, all in favor?
Aye.
Unanimous. All right. Ready? Okay. Agenda item 12, adjournment. I'll entertain a motion.
Chairman, just so you know, obviously, the next zoning meeting will be August 6, 2019.
Okay, thank you very much. All in favor? Adjourned.